everyone, welcome to the What, Why, When podcast from Oxford University. My name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what's known as the Access Fellow at Jesus College, here with two fantastic guests to talk about nothing less than the meaning of life. So starting in alphabetical order, Jubeda, tell us a bit about yourself, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Jubeda. I'm a finalist historian studying at Jesus College. I specialise in more modern history, and I'm currently looking at Islamic communities during the Russian Revolution period.
Fab, thanks Jubeda. And Yannick?
Hi everyone, I'm Yannick. I'm a first-year physicist, undergrad. So very excited to start my journey. And yeah, very much at the beginning of it.
Fantastic. Well, what a question. What is the meaning of life? That has got to be one of the all-time great questions of humanity. Actually, I've been told by a philosopher that they don't like the construction of the question. They don't like the words used. And specifically, they really don't like the preposition of. So they tend to prefer what is the meaning in life rather than what is the meaning of life. Jubeda, can you imagine why they might prefer that construction?
I guess it's a pretty big question. So when you think of like what is the meaning of life, it's very subjective. I think every single person will have a different interpretation of the question. Right. Everyone has a different interpretation of what meaning it means to them as well. But I'm assuming it's like what is the meaning in life. I think that is more personal rather than it being like an objective truth, because I think to have an objective truth, you'd be getting into theological discussions, right, which, again, not everyone is religious. So I'm assuming those are the reasons why.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it just shows how particular we have to be about the wording in questions, right? And as you pointed out, there are words like meaning and life and so on that are also very contestable. So, I mean, Yannick, one possibility is that we try and come at this from a completely different angle. I mean, what if I was to ask you, for example, is a freshly cut flower any less alive than you are right now? So is a freshly cut flower any less alive than you are right now?
Wow. So we're getting at what is life at this
exactly.
point,
So we're trying to sort of get to what life might mean from a different angle. Exactly.
Well, surely a biologist would say, it's getting less alive because the activity in the flower is getting less and less. So perhaps it feels very weird to quantify life,
right?
In that sense, to say, well, it's slowly dying, right?
Yeah, right.
So, well, I don't know. I wonder whether life is quantifiable.
Well, exactly, and that's such a good question, right? What's going through your head, Jubeda, for that question?
I'm not sure, because like, if you think about like the circle of life, so like obviously we need nature, we need animals to kind of give. It's really important for them to like be part of the ecosystem, and so like kind of we can breathe properly, or we can have like fresh air, and we can eat, we can survive. Like it's really important. So I think, yeah, quantifying it in terms of one more significant than the other can be a bit difficult. But I guess a lot of people focus it on sentient beings. So like if you're sentient, so like the fact that we can feel, we can think, we have advanced level of comprehension compared to like a flower. I think that is generally what people might tend to go towards.
Right, exactly. So a biologist, going back to your point, Yannick, would say, well, if we do you remember Mrs. Gren from GCSE biology? If something moves and respires and is sensitive and grows and so on. These are sort of checklists of something that is alive, right? And a freshly cut flower actually just will continue with all of those things. So in that sense, it's as alive as we are in a sort of straightforwardly biological sense. And also depending on what you do with it, if you put it in water, you could be taking a cutting, you might actually be able to take more flowers out of that. So you're not necessarily dooming it to instant death if you cut it. But to your point, Jubeda, about sentience, right? So you could argue that it was never as alive as us because it's not sentient. So it doesn't matter whether it was cut or not. What do you make of that, Yannick? Do you think sentience is essential to having a meaningful life?
Well, I'm just wondering at this point whether we can come back to what we said at the beginning. And I'm wondering whether we have to make a distinction between in and off.
Okay.
So whether actually me perceiving the flower as a sentient being finds life in it rather than it being an intrinsic property of the flower.
Right.
So I wonder whether it's about the perception of life and not the intrinsic property of it.
That's a really interesting point. And of course, we don't, strictly speaking, know whether flowers have this really deep inner life that we're completely unaware of. They're judging us and they're the ones actually in charge. It's quite possible. Well, it's unlikely, but it's possible. Jubeda, why do we even ask questions like, what is the meaning of life? I mean, if we asked Charles Darwin, he might be tempted to say, well, any trait we have derived from some sort of survival mechanism, right? It helped our ancestors survive. And I guess I wonder why we're so curious to the extent that we would ask this sort of question. What possible survival instinct could that have adapted to?
See, I'm not thinking of it from like a scientific perspective. I see it as very much like when I think of like what is the meaning of life to some level, and I think this is very in line with my religion and my own personal beliefs with Islam, is that it kind of translates to like what is someone's purpose in life. I feel like that's what it tends to translate to. If you look at throughout history, generally speaking, with all different types of communities, both religious and non-religious, you see this urge of like a greater purpose of like fulfilling something. And obviously that differs based on the different cultures that exist. So like collectivistic, individualistic cultures, and it very much differs on like where you're brought up. But it is ultimately, I see it and I feel it in that it's like, what is your purpose in the like in life? I feel like that's what it translates to me. But maybe they can be two different things. I don't know.
Well, and as we said at the start, and as you pointed out, it is something that is quite personal. It's quite subjective. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with your interpretation in the slightest. But I suppose that begs the question, why do we perhaps yearn for a purpose? Or some of us?
I mean, the way I see it, so if I'm thinking about religion in this instance of like purpose, is that ultimately we all have a purpose in life. So for Muslims, the Quran tells us, God is directly speaking to us that he has made jinn and mankind except to worship me. So for a lot of Muslims, especially in this holy month of Ramadan, it's a lot to do with worshipping, it's a lot to do with serving the community. So like that is what we call fitra, so like our innate kind of inclination towards something. So what inherently are you drawn towards? And I think inherently we believe that people have a purpose of serving others or like worshipping a greater being. So for us, that's Allah. So that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think that's really interesting. I suppose I'm curious as to why we're so smart, Yannick, because one of the reasons why we might ask a question like, what is my purpose? What is the meaning of life? Is that we have these enormously large brains. They were calculated by an Oxford University institute recently that we have basically 28,500 iPhones worth of processing power shoved into our skulls. And I'm not sure Darwin would be able to answer how we're so smart. It feels like it's overkill at this stage. We're so capable that we come up with these mad questions about what is the meaning of life, rather than, as other animals presumably do, just live it. What do you think?
I'm wondering, though, whether humans tend to ask questions just for the sake of asking them. So I wonder if we hadn't had this ability you just described, I think humans would still ask these questions, no matter whether they'd be able to answer them or not, because, as you said, there's this feeling of fulfillment and purpose, something quite fundamental to the human being, I would say. So I don't think it's necessarily linked to capability, because humans just like asking these questions. And I think especially when you say, well, there is a purpose of life, let's assume there is a meaning in life. It's quite comforting.
Yeah.
And we humans like the comfort of security.
Well, and perhaps that comes back to your point about sentience, Jubeda, that because we are conscious of our own mortality, it is comforting to imagine that there is some point to all of this, that we're actually working towards something that we feel is worth working towards, I guess.
I think what people tend to do is, and we all face this in some way, shape or form, is that we focus a lot on our own struggles, in our own difficulties in life. You know, we might be having a shoot essay in a crisis and we like stress about it a lot. I've done that myself, but I think especially in a month like this, what we tend to do is think about others above our own. So it's that, again, you put in that sentient being, in that you humble yourself before others in some ways. You humble yourself before God, but you humble yourself to know that like other people are struggling more than me. So it, in some way, it kind of links to what Yannick, you were saying, in that like that purpose, and it's like it's inherent, where it's like you're helping others, but also you're reminding yourself constantly that it's like the trials and tribulations of this life, it kind of feeds to a greater purpose, and therefore helping others where you can is super important.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, of course, you know, I said Darwin might struggle to explain what's going on here, but there is one interesting explanation, which is if we compare Homo sapiens, human beings, to another hominid species like Homo neanderthalis or Neanderthals. Have you heard of Neanderthals? So they're sometimes depicted as sort of knuckle-dragging, idiotic fools, but actually they buried their dead and they had parties and they interbred with human beings. So the idea that they were stupid is misguided. But they didn't survive, and that begs the question, why did they not last, whereas human beings, Homo sapiens, did? One possible interesting answer is that they perhaps were not as curious as Homo sapiens. Now, how could we possibly infer that? Well, they didn't really move outside of an area in the sort of central European and West Asian flat plain land, right? So all of the remains of Neanderthals have been found from basically Germany through to Kazakhstan. And they didn't appear to feel the need or the urgency to move outside of those areas. And one explanation for their demise, therefore, is that as climate change happened with an ice age, they perished. Whereas human beings at the same time were colonizing America. Now, how does one colonize America? You literally had to walk there. You had to walk across the frozen Bering Strait, and not knowing that America was on the other side. Now, the resilience and the curiosity to be able to achieve that is absolutely incredible. I mean, I can barely walk through a mile of drizzle without complaining, but the idea of walking thousands of miles with dependence across a frozen ocean is mind-blowing to me. But what do you make of that, Yannick, that maybe Homo sapiens have these huge brains, have this enormous curiosity, and actually that is a major tool and an explanation for our survival?
Well, I think intuitively it would make sense to me without knowing the biological details, obviously. Sure. And I think it comes back to this like inherent curiosity, we like asking questions. And I think still today it's very much a part of our society that we like to think of ourselves as these curious human beings. So whether we are we will fulfill this image or not might be up to question, but at least us perceiving us in that way is quite powerful, I think.
Okay, great. So I'm going to take a different tack, and I'm going to go back to some small talk, because I love small talk. It's actually remarkably revealing to what someone finds meaningful in their life. So, Jubeda, I'm going to introduce myself to you, and I want you to sort of deconstruct my self-introduction, if you don't mind. So just tear it apart, try and tell me what you think I'm telling you, all right? So, hi, I'm Matt. I'm from Croydon in South London, and I once tried and failed to roller skate from Land's End to John O'Groats. So what have I told you there other than the literal information, do you think?
Well, you're telling me you're adventurous, so like trying out new things.
Right.
I think also slightly with your tone as well. You can tell like you're a friendly person.
Right.
So you have an English hi, so like it's, you can tell you're a friendly person.
Yeah.
I can maybe take a little bit from the fact that you're from Croydon. Maybe try to interpret, is that why you're quite adventurous? If I was trying to really look into it,
Sure.
but I think the main thing I get out is that you're quite adventurous and friendly.
Right. Okay. So absolutely. I mean, the classic trick to analysing anything is not just to look at what is there, but look at what's been hidden, right? Because that's what we do when we're engaging in a bit of small talk with someone for the first time. We're kind of opening up the museum of us, and we're showing people the exhibits, and we're hiding from them certain things we don't want them to see. So I said, hi, I'm Matt. It's kind of a lie, actually, straight up, because it's Matthew in my passport and my birth certificate. So you already know that, as you said, I'm friendly. I don't want there to be hierarchy. I want there to be a degree of informality. And then I said, I'm from Croydon, which is, again, a bit of a lie, I'm afraid. I mean, I was born in North London. I did spend the years from 8 to 18 in Croydon, but I haven't been there since. So why would I say Croydon specifically? I mean, it's a fairly nondescript place, right? You can't really judge me for it. People can get quite sort of concerned about how someone else might read into their biography, right? So if I said to you something more honest, such as, hello, I'm Matthew and I'm from Oxfordshire, that's a different proposition, isn't it? Do you see what I mean? And then, as you pointed out, I said the complete non sequitur of roller skating, but crucially I failed, and that's true, I did fail. I didn't even make it out of Cornwall. So rather than saying I once successfully roller skated, which might sound a bit braggadocious, I'm saying, oh no, it was an ignominious failure. But you're right, I did also try it. What do you make of this, Yannick? Do you ever sort of sense that you are curating your own self-image when you introduce yourself to others?
Oh yeah, most definitely. And it's very interesting to look at how I introduce myself differently to different people.
Right.
Because always as you said, what could the associations be when I say this? Like what is the image I'm building in the other person's mind, right? So you select based off that. And also I think it was quite interesting that you put the fact about the skating as basically the third thing you said. So there's quite an emphasis on that, which I think is quite interesting. So
and just more generally, small talk is highly customary, right? There are certain beats you're meant to hit, aren't you? So you start with your name, and you might say where you're from, and there's certain expectations depending on the audience. You might say, how are you? To which the correct answer is, I'm fine. You can't really say anything else, can you? And this sort of points to deeper thing about human beings, which is, I suppose, for many of us at least, we find meaning in sociability, right? We find meaning in community with others. Do you think that's reasonable, Jubeda, or am I unusual?
No, I think that's completely right. I think everyone kind of craves a sense of like communication and socializing, and I think if you didn't, you, at least in our society, you're considered kind of like the like out of the norm,
right?
In some ways.
Yeah, and of course curating all sorts of other things about ourselves, like our image and even our tastes in food and film. When we're communicating these priorities or these ideas to other people, there's a sort of a subtext, I would argue, that sort of says, this is because I find this stuff meaningful. Right, we're going to switch gears again. I'm sort of going all over the map at the moment. But Jubeda, there's a wooden building in Japan. It's called the Ise Jingu Shrine. It's a magnificent Shinto shrine in the southwest, I think, of the country. Anyway, it lays claim to being the oldest surviving wooden structure on Earth that's still in continuous use. Okay, and it's a claim that's backed up by the United Nations. And they basically say this building's been there performing the functions of a shrine for 1,300 years, right? The problem with that claim is that in accordance with Shinto religion, the building is torn down every 20 years and rebuilt using completely fresh timber, but according to the same design. So my question for you is, do you think the building is, as it claims to be, 1,300 years old, or do you think it's at most 20 years old?
Oh, I wouldn't know how to approach that. I think there's like a lot of things and facts that I need to know before
Sure.
I can make a judgment on that. Especially because this is the first time I'm hearing of this.
Fair
building,
enough.
so I think just trying to deconstruct that would be quite difficult. But
Well, trust your gut, I suppose. What's your gut telling you?
I mean, maybe if the tradition is that it has to be rebuilt every 20 years,
Yeah.
but according to historians, the same building has existed for.
I mean, it's not physically the same. I suppose that's the key question.
Okay.
But it's sort of, if you like, its spirit is the same.
So I think that's what it is, and is that they've given the symbolism, I suppose, or like again that going back to this idea of meaning, maybe like the meaning that the building holds, or like
Yeah.
the symbolism it has, is still the same, but the physical outer exterior has changed every 20 years, if that's
Right.
what the tradition is.
Exactly. So Yannick is a physicist. Surely it's not the same building, is it?
Well, I would actually more lean towards the meaning interpretation, because like what is the building? Surely the building, well, you can either define it as like the physical assembly of atoms, but then you've got problems because like we are changing, right? So
Yeah,
why
exactly.
if I define myself through my atoms, that's a bit weird, right?
Yeah.
So actually, perhaps it's, again coming back to what's the meaning in it,
Yes.
rather than the assembly of it. So if you define the building through the meaning in it, then surely it's been changing slightly, but it sounds pretty constant.
Well, and can I ask you a personal question, Yannick?
Yeah.
How old are you?
17.
17. So how much of you is 17 years old?
Ooh, from a biologist's perspective.
Yeah,
or-
so in other words, what cells are you walking around with today that you were born with?
Ooh, interesting question. I don't know. I suspect very few.
You're right, exactly. So you see where this is going, right?
Well, but then if we take the meaning approach,
Yeah, right.
then surely like my 0 to 1 year old doesn't contribute as much as
Oh,
my 16
possibly.
to 70 year old.
Possibly.
So
Well,
does
that could be your interpretation.
But then your 0 to 1 is like your foundational years. Like
Sure.
for example, if you got really ill between like 0 to 5, then that can change the course of your entire life.
And that would mean a lot to your parents, of course, so your family. Your
So
zero
the
to
meaning
one.
is there as well, in terms of the meaning to your parents, the meaning to the people around you.
yeah, I wonder whether we have to distinguish between meaning and memory at this point.
Okay.
Because I think what I've been referring to is memory, my active recollection of things,
Yeah.
of events. But then, of course, I've got no memory of when I was 0. But then, like, it still holds meaning because it's got an impact, it's got some sort of causality in it.
Yeah.
And I wonder which approach would be more useful.
So in terms of what cells we still have, throughout our lives that we're born with, you're right. It's not many. It's a few brain cells, although you can absolutely grow brain cells. I mean, it's a bit of a myth. You only kill brain cells. Obviously, you don't have the same size brain now that you had when you were born. You have some eye cells from when you were born, some bone marrow cells, and women out there, your eggs. You're born with all of your eggs. But otherwise, as you say, on an atomic level, nothing is particularly stable. And in the cellular level, it's all changing quite fast. And specifically, every second, our body produces 1 million new red blood cells. So we are in personal sort of material flux, and I find that quite interesting because then that forces us to reflect on, well, what makes us? If we're not physically permanent in any sense of the word, then it is more that sort of sense of the meaning or the spirit, or if I can put it in computer science terms, we're more software than hardware, aren't we? We are a code, like the plan for the building in Japan. That's constant, but the material is not. But that doesn't necessarily matter, does it? What are your thoughts, Jubeda?
I think when you were saying about that, it's like the extra, for example, like, it's very much based on the spiritual, based on like this idea of meaning. For me, it's just so intertwined with, again, what I was saying at the beginning about religion,
Sure.
because I think another meaning of life, or again, the purpose of life, is also the purpose of like the afterlife, which we believe exists, right? Well, in Islam, we believe it exists. So
Sure.
it's, I think when I think about everything you're saying, it intertwines with that. It kind of confirms that belief that I have in that, like, you work towards a greater thing of like the afterlife, or like when you're resurrected on the day of judgment. Like I think about that in terms of the meanings. Like, we will literally be like, our bodies will decompose, but what would remain is, Yannick, like you're saying, this idea of like memory. What remains is the impact we had on people, not our physical bodies. And I
Right.
think that's the same thing with the building that you were saying. Like, the physical exterior is not there, but the meaning it holds. But then I think at one point in time, like, even us as people, the memories people have of us will die down too. But what will remain is, I think, particularly for religious people, is that God sees everything in terms of your deeds, in terms of your impact that you've had on people. Like, that continues no matter what. And I think in the afterlife, at least for what I believe from my Islamic values, is that it will kind of pay off. Like, working towards something, it pays off then, i.e. the meaning of life, in that it pays off there. I don't know.
Right. No, interesting.
Sorry.
No, it's fascinating. I mean, in terms of the timescale for the body's rotation, it's thought that it takes about 7 years for all of the cells in your body to be replaced, some of which will be much faster, like blood cells, and others will be much slower, like bone cells. But, I mean, it'd be a bit odd to say to someone that you're physically 7 years old, especially given that we are, all of us who are over 7 years old, including people who are in their hundreds, which is a bit odd, isn't it? And the only reason that they appear to age is because their genes are instructing their cells to degrade. And indeed, that therefore suggests that aging is a genetic disorder that could be corrected with gene therapy, which is a slightly spooky thought. You two could be amongst the first generation who could potentially look 20 for the rest of your lives. You're chuckling, but if that was a serious proposition, how do you think that would change your view of life, Yannick?
It very, very much reminds me of the picture of Dorian Gray.
You're right. Sure.
I've read it over winter vacation. It's
Sure.
just... Yeah, I wonder... Coming back to the we are more software than hardware, surely if you like make alterations to the hardware by saying we're not aging, surely the more important bit must lie in the software. Now the software might respond to the change in the hardware, but it's very difficult, because then also what do you do when the software changes abruptly because of some event which makes continuity difficult?
Yeah, right.
Like, does your person like...
Yeah, are you a different person? Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, we should get onto the physics of life. So Jubeda, you've talked about metaphysics, so they're where the material of the universe comes from, and I happen to think that there's no incompatibility between stories that come from physics and stories that come from metaphysics. So I'm not going to try and use physics to try and say anything you've said earlier was wrong. I don't think you can do that. But Yannick, you're the physicist, so I need a bit of help here. How can a physicist explain biology? In other words, do you happen to know which laws of the universe can help us understand why we are sat here nattering right now?
Well, I'm drawn to think about emergent phenomena. So physics is all concerned about how the fundamental interactions between particles, also on a big scale, but and then what's interesting is biology, in my opinion, is just an emergent property of matter. And I know, emergence is this very curious thing of like, you see patterns emerge, but you didn't expect on a small level. So it's in my mind, I'm just trying to separate these two realms to not make them clash, because I'm just saying, well, they're two different realms. Yeah. And one of them comes from the other, they're related, but I can't use the methods in one to
Right.
analyze the other.
Right.
That sort of idea.
Well, I am not a physicist, so I'm well outside of my comfort zone. But I have been told by a physicist that, I mean, you're right, but there's also the laws of thermodynamics are sort of particularly of interest here. So the first law of thermodynamics describes the conservation of energy. So energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Which, going back to your point, Jubeda, about the sort of the permanence of the spirit, that the energy that created Cleopatra is still with us and will never disappear from the earth or from the universe, which is quite cool. The second law of thermodynamics describes this concept of entropy, that energy, whilst not being created nor destroyed, will... This is where I'm going to struggle. I might need your help, Yannick. It sort of tends towards heat energy, right? It becomes less useful. It goes from free to heat. It sort of decays. What sort of language would you use to describe entropy? Am I on the right lines?
I think that's fine for now.
Fine for now.
I mean, entropy is quite difficult.
We could have a whole symposium on this, no doubt. But and because energy is sort of slipping down this gradient, that's part of the reason why the arrow of time pushes in one direction, I believe, right? And so everything from the Big Bang to the whatever comes at the end of the universe is sort of slipping in one direction. Now, what's that got to do with life? Well, some physicists reckon that biology or organisms are like a catalyst for entropy. So they utilize energy and they speed up the process. And so it's just because it's in the flow of the universe that we have organic matter. And specifically, a couple of physicists and chemists came up with this primordial soup experiment in the just after the Second World War, where they produced a fluid which was based off what the Earth's oceans were like billions of years ago, and filled it with these sort of chemicals like water and ammonia and methane and carbon monoxide, and sent arcs through it that would recreate lightning strikes. And they heated it, I think, as well, to recreate what it would be like with volcanic activity from beneath. And basically they produced amino acids in this tank, and amino acids are the precursors for proteins, and they are in turn the precursors for cells and life and all the rest of it. So they basically cooked the precursors of life on a hob in a lab. What do you make of that, Jubeda?
I don't know what I make of that. That's like, it's very fascinating.
It's a big question, isn't it? How about you, Yannick, as a physicist? What's going through your mind?
Well, this is pretty cool. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, and I mean it's a precursor of life.
Sure,
We're very much like looking at this controlled environment. I assume with some speeding things up. But I mean, obviously, it poses the question like, what if you just keep waiting and keep going and keep going further until you get like more complex structures. I mean, surely that's something fascinating to look at.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, of course, there's, as with any scientific endeavour, there's no absolute certainty around these things. These are hypotheses that are being tested rather than truths that are being revealed to the world, and everyone's still entitled to fill in the various enormous gaps in this. And one thing that I would just finish on is that I, as a young person, suffered a lot with anxiety, and I always tried to fill my life with meaningfulness in order to try and overcome that. And as I've gotten older, I've been humbled by experience that trying to engineer meaning in your life can sometimes not work. You don't always have full control. And I'm reminded in particular of one of the most meaningful things that ever happened to me in my life, which was when I helped deliver my second son, and specifically sort of caught him. My wife went into labour unexpectedly, and she was giving birth in our living room, and I caught his head before it smacked onto our floor. Now, I tell you this because I'm half blind and I don't catch things ever. So I managed to catch his head. And the reason this is such a notable story is that at the time, I have never been more calm and relaxed in my life. I just leant down and I caught his head and I stopped it smacking on our hard floor. And I was talking to the paramedics about checking that the cord wasn't wrapped around his neck and all the rest of it. And I was absolutely cool, calm and collected. I've never been more relaxed in my life, even though it was an objectively very stressful situation. And only hours after, I was a complete wreck. The reason I'm telling you this is that I was so dumbfounded by that experience. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't part of the script. Nothing about it was planned. It wasn't something I had any control over. And yet I was somehow overcome by this incredible serenity. And it will stay with me for life. But just as a sort of final thought, Jubeda, what are your sort of reflections on that? Because it seems to tap into what you've been saying a little bit about.
Yeah, I think it takes into account a lot of the things we discussed. So one of the things that, just slightly to go back to, you mentioned this idea of age or changing like your biological clock in terms of genetic mutations. But I think a lot of our age is also defined by experience. So I think what you just said right now, like myself or Yannick, we can't say that, oh yeah, I've had the same experience. And I think in some ways it is related to your age. A lot of it is because when you live a certain amount of years, you have a lot of experiences. And obviously that will differ based on different cultures, different identities, but it is a big thing in terms of our experience defines our age. I mean, when you were talking in terms of like, I think of like the paternal and maternal instincts that parents often have, and I think that is, again, going back to this word fitra, it's your innate being. It's like, it's a natural inclination that you have. So the fact that I feel like in that situation you had to be calm. If you were panicking,
right,
you know, so I think that in some ways the way I see that is like it shows me again like the miracles of God, in that like, especially when you see parents and the mercy and loving nature that parents have towards their children, but especially to like handle such a stressful situation like that and do it with such calmness. I don't know, it kind of shows me again the mercy of God through parents, because we're often in Islam, it's emphasized that, you know, like God's mercy knows no bounds, and we only see like one of that in humanity. Like we only see 1% of God's mercy we see in this world. So instances like that, it's like, wow, like, and that's only 1% of God's mercy. So that's the kind of reflections I'm getting now when I see it in terms of like, I think we all have a natural inclination, and where that comes from, you can question it, but again, you can say it's biological, you can say it's from God. But yeah, it kind of links back to what I was saying at the beginning.
Well, I think that you can question it. That's pretty much the tagline of this podcast series. So I can't think of any better way to end it there. So thank you both very much for your input. It's been really fascinating to talk to you. And thanks ever so much to you, the listener. Do tune in next time to the What, Why, When podcast, when we'll talk about something else completely intriguing and bonkers. Thanks. Bye.